welcome to our Succeeding with Forecast Pro webinar series. In today's webinar, we are going to focus on forecast accuracy measurements. Welcome everyone. My name is James Berry, and I'm the Director of Training here at Forecast Pro, and I'll be guiding you through our webinar today. Let's begin with a few logistics. We run this webinar series once every quarter. Our next webinar will be in November, and it will be focusing on product hierarchies and decisions you need to make about that. Also note that we do record all of our webinars, including this one, and we will post it to our YouTube channel immediately after today's webinar. You can also visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/forecastpro to download any of the previous webinars in this series. In addition to this Succeeding with Forecast Pro webinar series, we also have a general forecasting topic webinar series that we also run once a quarter. You can see that on our Forecast Pro website to see more about those series. In addition, we also have a live seminar series that we run multiple times a year. Our next one will be in December in Orlando. And finally, myself and my colleague Franklin do run customized web-based training. So if you want to do a more in-depth training using your real data, we're happy to help. Please contact Franklin in our chat right now. And speaking of our chat, Franklin will be monitoring it throughout this webinar. At the end of today's session, we're going to do a Q&A where I'll take your real questions. If any questions come up throughout this webinar and you want to ask them, please use the chat functionality built into the Zoom meeting. We'll be monitoring that the whole webinar, and we'll be compiling a list to answer at the end of today's session. So with those logistics out of the way, let's talk about our agenda. We're going to start with a basic overview of forecast accuracy, how you measure it, what key statistics that we have, and what reports are available within Forecast Pro. We're then going to dive into a demonstration using Forecast Pro and walking through some key examples of how to measure forecast accuracy, both on an item basis as well as on a global basis. We'll wrap up the formal part of the webinar with some conclusions, and finally, as I mentioned, we'll end the webinar by answering any questions that you, the users, have. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's begin with our overview. And we're going to focus initially on key statistics for measuring forecast accuracy. In Forecast Pro, there are two key statistics that we focus on, the unit error and percentage error. So rather than focus on accuracy, we do look at errors. The unit error is the MAD, which stands for mean absolute deviation, and the percentage error is the MAPE, which stands for mean absolute percent error. Let's see how these are calculated. The MAD is a measure of error in units. While the formula looks a little complicated, it's actually very straightforward. It's just the absolute value of the actual minus the forecast, and then we just average those together. So here in my chart below, you can see we have 4 months of actuals, and followed by 4 months of forecast. To calculate the MAD, all we do is we subtract the actuals minus the forecast. So in month 1, it's 112 minus 124. We take the absolute value, so we drop the negatives, and that's a difference of 12. For month 2, it's 108 minus 103. Absolute value is 4. For month 3, it's 148 minus 116. Absolute value is 32. And for month 4, it's 117 minus 78 for an absolute value of 38. So now we have our 4 absolute errors. All we do is average those together. So we average them together, and we're off on average by 22 units. Again, the key thing to remember is that the MAD is in units. Now its companion statistic, the MAPE, the mean absolute percent error, is the same number just as a percentage. So once again, we're going to take the absolute value of the actual minus the forecast, but then we will simply divide by the absolute value of the actual, and then we'll multiply these by 100 to get these into percentages. So again, in my chart below, I have 4 months of actuals and say 4 months of forecasts, and we're just going to do the actual minus the forecast, 112 minus 124, and take the absolute value, and then we divide by 112, multiply by 100, and that gives us an 11% error. For month 2, we have a 4% error, month 3, a 21% error, and month 4, a 33% error. And once again, we just average these 4 numbers together, giving us an average percent error of 17%. Again, the MAPE is a percentage. Now, it is our recommendation that we always report both the MAD and the MAPE together, because they complement each other. Most folks focus only on the percent errors because it's easier to compare items. If I have a 10% error on item 1 and a 35% error on item 2, I probably did a better job on item 1. However, the big problem with focusing on percent errors only is that they can be thrown off by low volume data. If I said we were going to sell 2 units next month, and we end up selling 6 units next month, that's a 300% error. And if I said I missed by 300% last month, that sounds terrible. But if I said I only missed by 4 units, that doesn't sound so bad. So while the percentages give us a point of comparison, the unit errors, the MADs, give us a sense of scale. Now obviously the MAD by itself means nothing. If I said I missed my forecast by 500 units last month, is that good or bad? Well, if I average 200 units a month, that's not so good, but if I average 50,000 a month, that is pretty good. So once again, we do expect you to report both of these together, and in a lot of the reports that we will see today in Forecast Pro, we will show both the unit and percent errors side by side. Now, what are some key things to think about when reporting these? As mentioned, the MAPE and the MAD are a measure of error. Most people, and even the name of this webinar, report accuracy. The accuracy is the inverse of the error. So for example, instead of an error of 15%, most people would say they had an accuracy of 85%. It is important when looking at these numbers to understand which one you're referring to. Am I referring to error or am I referring to accuracy? So that is an important key distinction to MAPE. The other key distinction is that the MAD and the MAPE are unsigned. You noticed in the calculations, we were taking the absolute values. This meant we were dropping any negatives. Now we do this because we're just looking for distance. We don't care if you overshot or undershot, we just care how much you missed by. See, if we left the signs in, which we do in some of our key statistics, this becomes, rather than a measure of error, a measure of bias. You see, if I had a 100% positive error, then a negative 100% error, if I average those together, they would cancel each other out and show 0. Well, that's a 0 bias. It's not a 0 error. And so while we do report those numbers, and it is very important to look at bias when measuring forecast accuracy, we are going to focus on the unsigned, the MAD, and the MAPEs. Now that we know the statistics, what reports do we actually use to measure forecast accuracy? Within Forecast Pro, there are multiple reports that show this forecast accuracy, including the tracking report, the exception reports, the forecast value add reports, and the override reports. All of these reports are focusing on a different KPI, or key performance indicator. And so it's about using the right report based off of what information you're trying to measure accuracy against. And it's the purpose of these reports that basically identify items that are not performing well and need your attention. Which items do I need to actually look at? Now, the reports fall into 2 different categories. There are global reports and individual reports. A global report will show information across all items in your product hierarchy, and this is a good way to narrow in on the items that need to be viewed. The individual reports will show you the details of forecast accuracy on an item-by-item or group-by-group basis. So I can use the global reports to find the items that I need to review, and then use the individual reports to see the details of where we're performing well and what could be causing these issues. So what are some key decisions to make when you're measuring forecast accuracy? The first decision to make is about lead time. What lead times should you be using to measure forecast accuracy? It's true that the further out you forecast, the less accurate you will be, and that makes sense. It's easier to produce a forecast for next month than it is 2 years into the future. So the longer we look, the less accurate we will be. So we need to figure out a lead time. And different SKUs can have different lead times, so we might want to set up these reports differently. In our examples today, we will be focusing on a 2-month ahead lead time. And this is actually one of the most common because it's usually current month plus 1. So whatever month I am in, plus 1 on top of it. So I'm trying to forecast the next month beyond. That would be a lead time of 2. So when we look at our examples today, we'll be focusing on a lead time of 2, but this is really dependent upon what company you're in. The next important decision is, are you going to look at the statistical or the adjusted forecast accuracy? The statistical forecasts are what Forecast Pro produces, whereas the adjusted numbers contain any of the overrides that you have made on top of that. Now, in general, you would hope that your adjusted numbers are better. You understand your products, you understand your customers, you understand your markets. And the whole reason you are making these overrides is to make the forecast better. And in general, this is what will happen. But in a lot of the reports we will see today, we'll compare both the statistical versus the adjusted to see if our overrides did in fact improve forecast accuracy. Third, we need to determine what hierarchy level we're going to measure accuracy at. We can measure forecast accuracy at any hierarchy level in your Forecast Pro project. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that the higher up you go, the better your accuracy tends to be. And in a weird quirk of statistics, the bigger your project, meaning the more items you have in your project, the better your forecast accuracy will tend to be at the higher levels. And this is not necessarily because we're forecasting better, it's simply because of a rule of large numbers. I always give this example of if I took a quarter and I flipped it 3 times in a row, statistics tells me that there's actually a 12.5% chance of getting heads all 3 times in a row. It's just 50-50, 50-50, 50-50. Now, of course, if you saw me do this, you'd say, oh, wow, that's kind of a lucky quarter. But there's actually a greater than 10% chance that that will happen. But if I flip that same quarter 30,000 times, I'm going to get 15,000 heads and 15,000 tails because it is a random occurrence. And that's what tends to happen with forecasts. If I have a project with 30,000 series in it, there's a good chance that the vast majority of those are very low volume, newer products, and going to be very difficult to forecast, and they're not going to be very accurate. But I have so many chances of not being accurate that half the time I'll overshoot and half the time I'll undershoot. I'll add those together and I'll do really well at the high levels. And so one of the key things to determine when measuring forecast accuracy is, where should I be forecasting? Now we'll see in our examples, we're always going to focus on our actual SKUs. And that's because SKUs are what you actually sell and produce. And so when we look at forecast accuracy, that's a great place to begin. Finally, we need to look, is our accuracy improving over time? A lot of companies will just arbitrarily set a forecast accuracy number. They'll just say, look, across the board, we need to have less than a 15% error. And it may or may not be useful. You see, what if that's really easy for your A items, but really, really hard for your C items? But you're doing a good job with your C items. Why? Because your accuracy has been improving over time. See, if I have a 60% error and I lower that to a 30% error, I'm still not hitting that 15% accuracy that I'm talking about, but I've reduced my error by 50%. I've gone from 60% to 30%, and that's going to save me in production costs, shipping costs, and inventory costs. And so overall, we don't want to just be setting arbitrary targets. We want to be looking at our accuracy not just today, but has it been improving over time? And that's a very important measure of forecast accuracy as well. So now let's discuss our examples. Today we're going to be looking at 4 specific examples using Forecast Pro. We're going to look at multiple level accuracy. We're going to use our exception reports in a number of different ways to look at the accuracy exception report and the custom exception report, where we will measure both the statistical versus our adjusted versus external forecasts, and we're going to do it both monthly as well as quarterly. So here in our first example, we're going to look at accuracy across multiple levels. So as we discussed, picking a level to measure forecast accuracy is very important. Do we do it at the top line, or do we do it lower at our skew levels? And for this first example, we'll use the waterfall report to look at a grand total, as well as looking at the skew level. So let's take a look at that now. So here we are in Forecast Pro, and we have loaded in our standard auto parts data. This is a 4-level hierarchy starting with a grand total. This then breaks down into different product categories. We see mufflers, rims, seats, and windows. This then breaks down into different location warehouses: Chicago North, South, Dallas, New York, and Phoenix. And finally, this breaks down into SKU. It is important to note that we have SKU down here at the bottom level of our hierarchy. You can also see throughout the hierarchy we have lots of overrides as well as model changes. This reflects a real-world scenario where in your real project you would have multiple overrides and adjustments. And this will help us when measuring forecast accuracy to look at changes made both from a model standpoint as well as from an override standpoint. We also have multiple override rows that we have labeled here. We have sales, we have demand planning, and we have consensus. So each of these would be given feedback from different sources. So whether it was sales, the planning team, or from some sort of consensus review. And as you can see, we have lots of overrides and comments that have been made in here to help us when looking at our forecast accuracy reports. Again, one of the things we looked at is the comparison between the statistical versus the adjusted. For our first example, we're going to use the waterfall report. So I've clicked on our grand total, and we can see our waterfall report has been opened over here. In this report, we can see here in green, this is my historical data over the last 6 months. Down below, I can see my forecast from 6 months ago, from 5 months ago, 4 months ago, 3 months ago, 2 months ago, and last month. So I am tracking forecast accuracy over the last 6 months. I have also specified to look at a lead time of 2 months. So what's highlighted here in blue are my 2-month ahead forecasts. I have 5 of them. So from January, I forecasted March, February, I forecasted April, etc. The statistics for this are shown down below. So my 2-month ahead lead time, I have 5 observations, and we can see our MAD up here at the grand total is 33,000 units, and our MAPE is about 27%. So we can see at the grand total level, here are our MAPE and MAD numbers that we would be focusing on. Now, as we've also mentioned, in addition to these 2 key statistics, we need to look at the difference between the statistical and the adjusted number. Right now, I'm showing the adjusted forecast, which includes all of my overrides. And again, if we look at our MAPE, it's about 27%. Now, I can right-click on this report and change it from the adjusted number to my statistical number. And if I go ahead and do that, you'll see it adjusts, and my MAPE is actually about 30% for my statistical. So when I toggle back to my adjusted of 27%, that means my MAPE is better. It is lower. I have a lower error. So my overrides have improved my forecast accuracy over time, and that is what we would expect to happen. Now, a lot of people will focus just on this top line number, especially this percent error up here, and say 27%, that's my overall number. However, as we've talked about, we don't sell companies, we sell actual products. And so what I've also turned on here in my tracking report is the end item analysis. And to do that, I will simply right-click and turn on my end item analysis. Now, in my hierarchy structure, the end item, the bottom level of my hierarchy, is my SKUs. So I can look across all of these SKUs, and you can see, for instance, this SKU has 5 observations at 2 months out. This SKU has 5 observations at 2 months out. And if I added all of those up, I would have just under 12,000 2-month ahead observations across all of my SKUs. And if I took the average of those, you would see my MAD is about 35 units, indicating that a lot of my items at the bottom level are really low volume. They're averaging only about 35 units per month. And if I looked at my MAPE, I would have a whopping 122% error. That is significantly higher than the 27% error that we see at the grand total just using the total numbers themselves. Does that mean I have 122% error across all of my SKUs? No. A truism of measuring accuracy is that low volume items can cause very high percent errors, as we've talked about. And so to try to compensate for this, we have created a new statistic, the W-MAPE, or the weighted MAPE. This weights my higher volume SKUs more heavily. And in doing so, we can take a weighted average so that the low volume items don't distort the percentage error. And in this case, my weighted average is about 51%, almost double my 27% that I see up here at the grand total. And this is something we would expect, which is that at the lower levels of our hierarchy, we will tend to do worse. And so if we were only going to look at one number, which I don't recommend, but if we were, this would be the starting point, our weighted MAPE across all of our SKUs, because this is an average percent error across the actual products that we sell, and that's where we want to look. Now this is just a big top line number, and as we said, we might want to actually look on an item by item basis to see how we were doing, because is this 51% good or bad? The only way to know is to look item by item, and is this improving over time? And that's what we really want to do. So to focus in on the items using this report, what we're going to do is use the hot list over here. Now how we'll do this is I'm going to go up here on my home tab and go to my options. And I'm going to click on our Pareto. I'm going to use this series count, and I'm actually going to create a list of my top 10 SKUs to look at. So I'm going to come in here and set my A item to my top 10 SKUs only. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And then I'm simply going to right click on my hierarchy and say Add to Hot List, Analysis, Pareto, and A items. So I'm going to create a hot list of my A items, and you can see it's just 1 to 10. So I'm going to go ahead and add those. And so now what I've done is I've created a hot list of my 10 highest volume SKUs. And if I click on one of these specifically, I can now see the information for this specific SKU itself. So I can see here my 2-month ahead forecast. I have 5 of them. My MAD was about 1,500 units, or about 35%. But what I can also do in this report is turn on the graph. So I can come over here and turn on my graph, and I'm going to go ahead and push auto arrange to evenly size these. And I'm going to right click on my graph and turn on the labels. And now what I want to actually see is, has my accuracy been improving or getting worse over time? So to do that, I can simply right click on the report and switch over to my percent errors. So here are the percentage errors of my data as I've been going. Back in March, I was off by 81%, in April, 26%, May, 44%, June, 18%, and July, 9%. So if I look at this, with the exception of April, I've actually been improving significantly. I went from 80% to 40% to 18% to 9%. This is good. In the last 3 months, my forecast accuracy has improved dramatically. I've gone from 44% down to 9%. I've cut my error by about 75%. And this is what we would hope to see. Even though my average says I was off by 35%, I have been improving greatly over time, and that's what I want to look at and focus on. On an item-by-item basis, let's look, have we been improving our forecast accuracy over time? These are the kinds of things that we want to look at. Now, if I go to the next item here on the list, what we'll also see is the opposite of that. If we look at the last 4 months, we've gone from 11% to 12% to 17% to 24%. We've actually made the forecast worse over time. And this is something that we really want to look at and say, why have we made it worse? And what can we do to improve it? If we look at this item's graph by itself, you can see that this item has been growing over time, but we've actually raised the forecast even more. We think the growth rate should increase, but unfortunately it just hasn't increased at the rate we were expecting. And so what we'd want to do is we want to say maybe these adjustments that we've been making to show this growth rate, maybe we've been a little bit too aggressive, and we might want to lower these forecasts a little bit. But the key thing here is we want to look item by item to see not just what our average is, but have we been improving or getting worse over time? And looking at this item by item, as opposed to relying on just a sole number here at my grand total, is a better indication of how accurate your forecasts really are. And so while it's tempted just to look up here at the grand total, get our one weighted number and say that's how well we're doing, it really doesn't paint the full picture that you want to see. For our next few examples, we're going to start focusing on our exception reports. Here in example number 2, we're going to start with the forecast accuracy exception report. This is by far the most used and most common exception report in Forecast Pro. In this example, we'll compare the statistical, which is just the model-based, with our adjusted forecast, which includes all of our overrides. And we'll look at this on a SKU-by-SKU basis to find where we did the worst so we can focus our attention on it. Now here in this second example, we're going to start using the exception reports. Now these are global reports as opposed to item by item. These are going to show information for all of our reports. We're going to start with our forecast accuracy report. And if I come over here to my settings, you can see I'm going to compare the adjusted forecast with all our overrides in it compared to our statistical forecast. And I'm going to do this on a lead time of 2. Again, current month plus 1. Here in the report, I have filtered down at my SKU level because, again, I want to focus on my SKUs. This is where we actually use this information. And if I scroll over, you can actually see I've set up this report. So we're showing you, here's what actually happened in July for all of our items. We have the statistical forecast for July, along with the unit deviation and the percentage deviation. And then we have our adjusted forecast for July, along with the unit deviation and the percent deviation. Now I've sorted this by unit deviation, largest to smallest. So I want to see where I have the highest unit error. Again, we don't focus too much on the percentage errors because if we did so, a lot of the really low volume items would bubble to the surface because they have very large percent errors. So instead we focus on the unit errors. What we can also see in this report is we also have a comparison. This is basically saying we are looking at our statistical versus our adjusted, with and without overrides. Now, in this case, it says the forecast is better. This means I have made overrides and I actually made it better. Whereas tied means I did not make any overrides, or statistical is better means that I made an override and I actually made it worse. So here on my first item where the forecast is better, you can see we sold 10,000 items. The statistical said we would sell 3,600. I raised it to 5,600. So Forecast Pro was off by 6,000 units. We were only off by 4,000 units. So we actually did improve it. We were still off by a lot, but we made it better. I've also added both of these forecasts here to the graph so you can actually see what we're looking at. Here at the vertical line, we're saying, look, we sold 10,000. The blue line is my adjusted number from 2 months ago, where we said 5,600. The pink line is my statistical from 2 months ago, where we said 3,600. And so you can see we made an adjustment to make it higher, but we didn't make it nearly high enough for an item like this. So we did make it better. But if we look at an item like this, where the stat forecast is better, this is a problem. So once again, we sold 3,600 units. Forecast Pro said we would sell about 5,000 units, but we even raised that higher to 5,600. So we actually made it worse. Forecast Pro was off by about 1,400 units, and our adjustment was off by 2,000 units. So this is bad. We spent time and effort making changes, but we didn't actually make it better. We made it worse. And so one of the things we could filter on, for instance, here in our comparison would be show me everywhere where the statistical is better, so that I made an override, but I actually made it worse. And we could start reviewing some of these and start saying, why did we make this change? And should we change the forecast going forward? You can see here we put a large bump up and it's been going on for a few months. If I go to my overrides here for this item, you can see we still have a raised forecast for the next 2 months, saying that we raised it 10%. Does that still make sense? Or should we actually lower the forecast down because we're just simply not selling as much as we thought? So once again, very important for us over here in our report to check, where have we made changes? Have those changes improved? And should we be actually making additional changes because our overrides did not work as well as we thought they were going to? Here in our third example, we're going to compare an external forecast to our final forecast in Forecast Pro. In our last example, we looked at the statistical versus the adjusted. But what if we load in an outside external forecast? In this case, we're going to use the custom exception report to compare our final adjusted forecast to that external forecast that we loaded in. So now here in our third example, what you can see is I've actually loaded in an external data set, in this case a customer forecast. What if your customer gives you a forecast, or what if your finance department gives you a forecast, or someone else gives you a forecast, and instead of comparing our statistical versus our adjusted, what if I want to compare the accuracy of our forecast here in Forecast Pro to what we loaded in from an outside source? So once again, you can see here, here's my customer forecast. They gave me a 12-month forecast, and we're going to compare the most recent month, which is July. And we have our previous forecast that we generated 2 months ago, which we also have a forecast for July. So we can compare what actually happened to our customer forecast versus ours. So now, instead of like the last example, where we compared the statistical versus the adjusted, we're going to compare our adjusted forecast to our customer forecast. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and bring up our exception report. Now we're looking at the same thing, except instead of using the forecast accuracy report, I'm using the custom exception report. And if we take a look at the settings here, you can see I'm comparing the history to my customer forecast and my previous forecast 2 months ago. And I'm just looking at the most recent month of history, which in our case is July. So I can go ahead and look at the report, and it looks just like our previous report. Here's what we sold. Here's what our customer said, the unit and percent deviation. Here's our final adjusted number, the unit and percent deviation. And again, I've sorted it where we have the biggest deviations. And so here in this example, our first item, we sold 640 units. Customer forecast was for 700. Our forecast was for 964. So you can see that the customer forecast was only off by about 10%. We were off by over 50%. So in this case, they were actually better. And we can see that here on the graph. Again, the customer forecast is the orange line. Our forecast is the blue line, and we're looking here at the vertical amount. And just like before, we were comparing the statistical versus the adjusted number. Here we have the comparison of the customer versus the previous forecast. And you can see our customer, especially for a lot of these, was doing much better. If we double click on the second one, you can see here, we were expecting to sell 193 units. The customer said 70, we said only 26. And so the customer was closer to what we were trying to do. So once again, here, instead of just comparing the statistical versus the adjusted, we could load in an alternative forecast and say, how well did that alternative forecast do to our forecast in Forecast Pro? And once again, we can use these reports, sort it, and show us where we did the worst in comparison to what the customer also said. Here in our fourth and final example, we're going to start looking at quarterly accuracy. Up until this point, we've been looking at accuracy on a month-by-month basis. But what if we wanted to add together our history and our forecast to look at this on a quarterly bucket size? We can use the custom exception report here again to make this happen. So let's take a look at that now. So in order to measure a forecast accuracy at a quarterly level, we need to understand what forecast do we want to sum up to get our quarterly total. Now the history is easy. We're just going to add up what we sold in the last 3 months. So in my case, it's May, June, and July. I would sum these up, and that would give me my quarterly total for the history. But what about the forecast? Now I could use the forecast from, say, 3 months ago. In that case, that's what I see here, my previous statistical 3, and I could just add these up. But that's not what I actually consumed. Remember, I've been looking at everything at a lead time of 2, and so what I actually had, my lead time of 2 for May was actually from here. It's this 1986. My previous forecast 2 for June was generated 3 months ago, which is this 2234. And my 2 months ago from July was here, this 2052. And so I don't want to just take my forecast from 3 months ago. I want my 2 month ahead lead time over the last 3 months. I need this diagonal. And we do show that as a single series. This is what we call a statistical at lead time 2. So I'm taking these diagonals of 1986, 2234, and 2052, and I'm creating a single series. And so now I can sum my 2-month ahead forecasts over the last 3 months and compare that to the sum of what I actually sold over the last 3 months. And we have this both for the statistical as well as the final forecast. And that's actually what we're showing here on the graph. The green is what we actually sold. Here's my adjusted number in blue and my statistical here in pink. And so that's what I'm going to use to generate my forecast. So if I go ahead and open up my layout that I have here for my quarterly totals, you'll see I've once again used my custom exception report. And if I go ahead and go to the settings, in this case, I'm comparing the history and I'm doing over here, the forecast at lead time 2 and the statistical at lead time 2. I'm going back 3 months, so I'm looking at May, June, and July, the last 3 months, and I'm doing it cumulatively. That's the most important thing. I'm going to add these together so that I can see this number. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like in the report. If I come over here, you can see it shows my history of May through July. The sum in this case is 23,000. My forecast is for 15,000. My statistical was 12,000. And once again, we're showing the unit deviation and percent deviations for all of these. Let me make this just a little smaller so we can see it. And then we can also see which one was better. So if I look at this current item that I'm on, here you can see we sold 9,500 over the last 3 months. The adjusted number was for 6,900, and that was off by about 27%. My statistical was about 6,200, which was about 33%, so my adjusted is better. And I can see that I was off by about 33% over the quarter. Now what you'll look at, if we look at the graph, you can see actually this is interesting because again, the ups and the downs, we overshot in May, but then we undershot in June and July. And so if we're just looking at a 1 month off, we could be off by a lot, but if I take the average, because some months I overshoot and some months I undershoot, but overall I get the number better, that's what I'm really looking at. And so this report to look at quarterly totals is very, very useful. So I'm not just going to focus on how well we did last month, but maybe last quarter. We can also expand this out if you wanted to look at how did we do over the first half of the year. Let's go ahead and take a sum for the first half of the year. Let's do our forecast for the first half of the year, and let's look at that. So instead of just looking at averages, which is what the waterfall report does, or just at the most recent month, what if we want to look at the most recent quarter or the most recent 6 months? This becomes a very valuable tool to say, hey, maybe we got the ups and downs wrong, but how have we been doing from an overall forecast? And this is more important if you're in manufacturing or if you're in inventory control. This is something that you would want to look at. Again, leveraging the custom exception report to make this work. So now let's wrap up with some conclusions. As we've talked about, there are multiple reports in Forecast Pro where we can measure forecast accuracy. And one of the key decisions we need to make when choosing these reports is whether we want to look at the global reports, like the exception reports that look across all of our items and identify where we're performing poorly, or our item-specific reports, like our waterfall report that allowed us to drill in and see information over time. We also discussed the importance of measuring accuracy at specific hierarchy levels. In our first example, we looked at the grand total forecast accuracy versus the accuracy on a SKU by SKU basis. And we saw that at higher levels, we tended to have lower forecast errors and more accuracy. But that's not necessarily a measure of what we're actually producing as a company. And so determining what level of the hierarchy we're going to use to measure forecast accuracy is very important. We also looked at the accuracy of our statistical versus our adjusted. We looked at this month by month as well as on the quarterly basis, but this idea of, are my overrides adding value? Are they making the forecast more accurate? The whole reason we're doing these overrides is to try to make the forecast better. And so when we use our reports, we can see where that actually has happened or where our adjustments have actually made things worse, which can hopefully inform us where we should be making changes in the future. And then finally, we need to look at improvements over time. We stressed this earlier in the session, but that we don't want to set arbitrary targets. We want to say, hey, here's our error today. Is that error actually better or worse than it was last month or last quarter. And so we're always looking for these improvements over time. And the whole reason that we look at forecast accuracy is to try to refine and make our forecast better every time we do it.